I'm Dr. Sarah Jandricic, and I'm the Greenhouse Floriculture Integrated Pest Management Specialist for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness, which might be the longest job title in the world. And today I'm here to talk to you about scouting. So there's lots of challenges to scouting in garden centers. This talk isn't going to only focus on garden centers, though, because there's lots of different types of garden centers. There's retail only, there's retail and production, there's places that may include perennials and nursery plants as well. So my background is mostly in greenhouse production. So I'm going to focus on the retail and production type greenhouses or retail centers. So some of this information I'm going to share today on scouting might be really basic for some of you, and then some of it might seem overly involved for some of you. But the point is, I hope all of you can find some tips and tricks along the way that can help you, because scouting in these environments can be really complicated because there's so many different plants, so many different growth stages, and you've got different portions that might have to be scouted differently. So what I'm going to go over today is sort of the basics of scouting, but really focus on, getting the job done. So implementation in terms of where to spend your time, tools of the trade and techniques. And I'm also going to pass on a lot of tips and tricks from the pros. So biocontrol or pesticide company reps that are in greenhouses all the time and scout for some of their customers, as well as actual scouting consulting firms, because they're really in there every day. And I've learned so much from them over the years. Just an FYI of what we won't cover today. We don't have time to go over the specific pests and diseases you're going to find in your greenhouses or retail centers. And I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel if this has been done well somewhere else. So these are QR codes you can take photos of that will send you to links to other talks. So there's a great greenhouse pest management talk that goes over sort of the basics pests you're going to find in greenhouses from Utah State Extension. And then I've done a webinar before for tropical plants with Judy Colley from Plant Products with Michigan State hosting. So that's another option. So please feel free to go to those. So we're going to start off with the purpose of why do you scout? And that might seem very basic, but it's important to keep in mind why you're doing this. And that's because weekly evaluation will lead to a more targeted, predictive approach to pest management. And the end, that is going to save you money in terms of both, less pest management inputs and also less shrink in terms of plants that succumb to pests or diseases or just don't sell. It can also help you diagnose new issues along with managing existing issues. And one of the most important things I think it can do is help you get to know your problem areas. Every greenhouse has a problem crop or a problem area where pest problems pop up year after year. And again, if you can get sort of a predictive approach to that, it can save you money over time. And also just getting on top of problems early. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that in different talks, whether it be things like sanitation and stuff like that. But the earlier you can get on top of a problem, again, the more money you're going to save in the long run. So the first step to scouting is establishing a structure. So this is really just, getting into the nitty-gritty of who does the scouting, which crops do they scout, which areas, how often. When someone is sick or goes on vacation or leave, who covers for them? Is that person trained as well? How is the information to be recorded? After you've recorded the information, how are you going to transfer that to the right person? How is it stored? And how are you going to involve the actual person that makes the IPM decisions in doing the spraying? So I'm always happy to use myself as sort of a cautionary tale, because even experts like myself make mistakes. So in terms of planning, having a plan for when someone goes on vacation or sick leave, here's an example of why that's important. So this was an on-farm research trial I did with a grower when Thrips parvispinus first came on the scene and is a huge invasive pest of mandevilla, which gets sold in garden centers all the time. We had a little experiment going on with, action thresholds and things like that. So you can see things are bopping along pretty well from week 19 up to week 34. And then Sarah leaves to go for a conference, a little bit of vacation in France. So I was gone for over 2 weeks. I had left the greenhouse and their IPM scout thresholds for the pests, but I didn't actually leave them an action plan for what happens if that threshold was to be exceeded. And because it was experiment, they were also less inclined to just start spraying and ruin the experiment. So as you can see, the thrips numbers got a little scary. Luckily, I came back and really quickly realized what had happened. And we actually were able to treat these and get it back under control in a couple of weeks. And luckily, they were able to sell every single one of these plants. And I am not buried under somebody's new build of their greenhouse. But anyway, it's a cautionary tale for, yeah, what can happen when you don't leave really explicit instructions behind, or there isn't someone trained to take your place during a vacation. So this leads to one of my first pro tips. This is from Corey Cron. She's the owner of Herd IPM, which is a scouting service. So she recommends that you spend the time needed to catch pest or disease issues at the earliest possible stage because it saves so much money and time. For example, finding spider mites early before they can explode. Spider mites love to explode, especially in the heat of summer. So treating a couple of plants is way different than treating a whole bench that's now infested with spider mite. So the next step to scouting is actually putting it in practice. So where to spend your time, active versus passive scouting, and then actually spending a little bit of time of figuring out what caused the issue, and then other things like, evaluating if your treatments worked and some tools of the trade. So we're going to go into this next. So we're going to walk through some of these. The most important ones I have highlighted are where to spend your time, the difference between active and passive scouting, and actually doing a bit of detective work to figure out what caused the issue. So in terms of where to spend your time, especially in a garden retail center, but this is also true for production greenhouses as well, is areas of high risk. And these are fairly standard across greenhouses. So a lot of this is going to be your incoming plant material. So whether this is unrooted cuttings that you're sticking yourself, liners, or a finished product that are going, hopefully straight to the customer, anything that comes from a high risk area, so places with lots of pest pressure, places with lots of different invasive pests. So for example, Florida, Guatemala, Mexico, or even the Netherlands, because they can have less chemical pesticides registered than we do. So sometimes their stuff comes in loaded with a bit more pests. These are high risk areas. So you want to inspect it before it even comes off the truck if you can, because that way, if you have to do a credit back to the vendor, you haven't even really gotten it off the truck, and you haven't, most importantly, brought it into your greenhouse where those pest problems can sort of instantly spread. So a great tip by one of my friends, Suzanne Wainwright Evans, who you might know as the Bug Lady from Bug Lady Consulting. Her biggest tip for garden centers is for them to establish SOPs, or standard operating procedure, for what happens when you find a pest on the shipment. So who do you notify? Who talks to the vendor? Do you generally treat it yourself and then ask for some sort of, partial credit? Do you dispose of it? Do you ask for a full credit? So that's an important consideration. So when it comes to actually scouting the imported plant material, there's different ways you can do this. So if you're getting cuttings in that you're sticking yourself, you want to inspect this for a lot of the tiny hitchhikers that we have on plants, such as spider mites and thrips, which we know come in on imported cuttings. So generally, it would be best if you had a microscope for that, but even just inspecting them for damage, for diseases can be important. Another handy thing for finished product is, besides obviously, looking at the whole plant and also taking the plant out of the pots to look for root issues, is you can cut off the growing tips of some of the plants and actually wash these to detect some problem pests in low numbers. So I'm not going to show you this whole video, but this is a video we did on plant washing. It's especially relevant to tropical plants that get a lot of the weirdo pests. Again, you can scan this QR code if you want to watch the video yourself, but I want to just sort of like bop over here to the 350 mark. It's basically just involves putting plant cuttings in a little container with alcohol or soap and shaking them around, pretend you're making a little cocktail. And then you pour that solution through a filter, and you can find difficult to detect pests like thrips, parvis pinus, and broadmite. And then that can tell you whether you should probably be prophylactically treating for these pests before these go out on the floor, especially when you're talking about tropical plants, where those pots often end up inside a homeowner's home, where those pests could potentially proliferate and spread to their other houseplants in their house. So another place to spend your time is pest magnets. So I've outlined some of these for spring bedding crops on my blog. So we know different plants that are, magnets for aphids or broad mites or western flower thrips or spider mites. So knowing these plants are going to get these pests year after year allows you to sort of predict that and focus a bit more of your energy here, inspect a higher number of plants, spend a bit more time, and know what pests to look for. And again, treating them prophylactically if that makes sense for your facility. Tropicals are a big one for specific pest magnets. And again, because these are ending up in people's homes, that might be a place to spend more of your time. So things like Dracaena, we know it gets things like thrips and mealybugs. Dieffenbachia can get echinothrips and spider mites. Palms are notorious for sort of getting everything from spider mites to scales. Crotons also get thrips, and Calathea or prayer plants, as we've got pictured here, can get a lot of spider mites. So really any tropical plant coming from Florida, you probably want to treat prophylactically with things like soaps and oils for things like thrips and mites and mealybugs. And you might even consider treating them prophylactically with nematodes in the soil to prevent fungus gnats. Because again, no homeowner really likes to have a bunch of fungus gnats fly up, from their big, expensive potted tropical that they've just bought. So I'm going to quickly ask you a question. So in this scenario, where would you spend most of your time scouting? Would it be the spring bedding plants, or would it be larger tropical plants? And if you answered larger tropical plants, you would be right. We mentioned about the homeowner issue, but also these are the plants that are going to be around longer. Spring bedding plants, I like to say they're here for a good time, not for a long time. So getting them out the door is very important. On a nice weekend, they should be in and out in no time. And further, any pests that you are going to find on them, like aphids or thrips, they are not going to survive outdoor at a homeowner's. As soon as you put them in the garden, natural enemies are going to move in, different environmental conditions, and those pests won't be an issue. Whereas again, large, expensive, high-value tropical plants, those pests can subsist even for a while after you've put them out on a patio. Again, in this scenario, where would you spend your time? So we've got a propagation zone, if maybe you propagate some of your own plants for your retail center, or would you want to spend more of your time near budding or near sale? If you've answered near sale, you would also be correct. And that's because in propagation, we actually just assume pests are there and you want to treat accordingly. We know spider mite and thrips arrive on cuttings. And it's almost impossible to actually scout the cuttings, except with, a microscope at the very beginning. Once they're in propagation and they're wet from the mist, good luck finding anything. Whereas near budding, this is a critical point in plant development, because if thrips or another pest are going to attack, this is probably when they'll do it for that pollen source. They can get in the flowers and make a big mess. The other thing with this point of the growth stage is you still have time to treat before they go into a retail area and those flowers become fully open. So now we're going to talk about some tools of the trade of monitoring. Obviously, the basics are a good set of eyes. I have noticed as I get older, the younger the eyes are, the better. They don't need to fuss around with reading glasses and hand lenses. But anyone really should be also having a hand lens. 15 or 20 times magnification lets you see the small pests that we deal with, things like thrips and spider mites. Also, sticky cards are basically the backbone of scouting. This is true in the production area, but also the retail center. And I know a lot of retail centers can be a little bit wary of putting sticky cards and having bugs on them out in the retail center. But in a lot of locations, they actually use this as an education resource, telling people what kind of pests end up on the cards, some of the biocontrols they're doing at the back to control these naturally. And then you can even sell these as a value-added item for people who are taking houseplants home. And also when you're scouting, having some patience, because looking for little finicky things does take a while. So some more about these monitoring cards. There are different colors of cards out there. I'll talk about that a little more. Yellow, just as the general one, is probably the best. You can also get wet cards versus dry cards, and the dry cards are sort of sold as, oh, well, they're less sticky, so they'll be less annoying for you to put up. That is less true, but they also seem to catch less insects, in my opinion. So look for the wet glue ones. Something else you want to have is a waterproof marker to label these sticky cards in terms of when you put them up, and whether you've put them up pre-treatment or post-treatment can also be important. You also want to put these cards up in the same place each week because that lets you monitor insect levels over time and see trends. You might want to put cards, extra cards near vents or the pest magnet crops we talked about before. And then in terms of where they go in the crop, they should go just above the crop canopy. Lots of insects fly, but also other insects sort of just like bounce up onto them. And you basically want a card every 100 to 200 meters squared in the production area at least. So another hot tip from Paul Kelly, who's a technical sales manager from Copert, who used to be on Ontario, but now is in the East Coast, and we miss him, is using the right sticky card for the right job. For example, different colored sticky cards are used to monitor echinothrips versus Western flower thrips. So I swear to God, this is one of my only data slides I will show you. But this is just to show you that sticky card color, their efficacy can vary a lot by the pest you're trying to trap and the greenhouse involved. So if you look at this graph on the right, or sorry, pardon me, my left, with Parvis spinus, Western flower thrips, onion thrips, and echinothrips, we tested yellow versus blue cards in a tropical greenhouse. And you can see that for most of the pest, blue was really preferred. And this stays true, we find, mostly for Parvis spinus and echinothrips. Western flower thrips, it really depends on the greenhouse, and onion thrips seem to prefer yellow a lot. So if you look at the other graph on my right, where we tested yellow against a bunch of different colored blues for Western flower thrips in a potted chrysanthemum greenhouse, you can see that this one sort of school bus yellow with the wet glue really stood out as the champion. And then the other sort of less sticky yellow was equivalent to some of the blues. So really all of this is just to say you need to test what works for your facility and your thrips issues, because we really feel that the efficacy of the card color is not only related to the thrips species, but also maybe your covering type and the light quality that's coming through in your greenhouse. So the other big tool of the trade is a tapping pan. This is just like a white cookie tray that you can buy from the dollar store. And this works really well for thrips or other pests that are knocked off easily. And it lets you also see the different life stages of thrips that you might be dealing with. And look how happy this girl is. This is an IPM scout at a commercial greenhouse who was helping me tap some stuff. And this ended up being the regular way that she monitored some of the pests in their mandevilla. And look how thrilled she is to be tapping plants. So yeah, you've got this white pan, you tap your plant over it. I'll show you the video in a second. And then you've got your hand lens that helps you see the pests on the pan. And basically after you knock the thrips off, they'll be a little bit stunned for a minute. So you have to sort of wait, and then you'll eventually see them start moving. And then you can tell the adults and the larvae apart because the white pan makes them really show up. And then what you want to do if you're using this as a regular scouting method is standardize your plant taps. So basically tap the same number of plants in a crop each week. So that way you know what your pest pressure is per 10 plants. And you can compare those per week. So this is, I'll play this little video of tapping. Hopefully the sound comes through. But it's very satisfying. Things fall off. It makes a nice noise. So the other tools of the trades are obviously being able to know what you're supposed to be looking for when you go into the crops. There's lots of really good ID guides out there. I just would warn you to go to reputable sources. With the sort of uptick of things like Instagram and TikTok, we do notice a lot of amateur bug people out there showing pictures and videos of different pests and natural enemies, but often those can be wrong. So, I mean, everybody's trying their best, but not everybody's an entomologist. So if you are going to look for one of these ID sheets, try to go to some sort of extension resources, something from a government or a university. So this one is from the University of Montana. It's great. It's got pictures of damage and the pests. There's lots out there. The other thing is there's a lot of scouting apps now made from a lot of the big biocontrol companies. So you can reference the pest and their damage on those. So I know like BioLine has one, BioBest, Copert, places like that. You can also pre-make standard operating procedures for the kind of plant groups that you get in your greenhouse. So sort of bins you would see would be tropical foliage plants, bedding plants or perennials, and making sort of these little pest diagrams for yourself and your staff, depending on the typical kind of pests and damage that you see. Another really useful tip, tool of the trade is either different colored flags or different colored flagging tape. So this lets you mark a problem area for others to return to the spot. So this may be for someone else to come look at, or the person actually doing the IPM in practice tells them where they should spray or where they should concentrate their sprays or make sure they get good coverage. It also allows you to go back to that spot after treatment and make sure the pests haven't spread, that the treatment has worked. And then just don't forget to remove the flags once the issue has been resolved. And as I mentioned before, you can use different colored for different pests. So different greenhouses will use like red for aphids or blue for mealybugs. So that way anyone walking by can sort of know there's a problem area there. And if you want to get really sophisticated, there's lots of scouting softwares out there now. I kind of didn't think AI would ever sort of reach this point where it could identify insects on the yellow sticky cards, but it actually can. It can't identify them to species. It'll just tell you, I'm a thrips, but it won't tell you what thrips it is. But you can see on this example that it's pointed out a thrips and a whitefly and a fungus gnat. So this makes card counting easier and faster. It also identifies the pests for you. The other thing I really like about it is this information can often be uploaded to a dashboard. So it can actually tell you over time what the pest pressure is of your different pests in your different locations or facilities. So some examples out there are Bug Vision. Copert has a program called NatureTech. BioBest has something called TrapEye. This isn't all inclusive. There's lots of other ones out there. So talk to your supplier. Maybe they have one. They can sometimes cost money if it's going, especially if it's going to be uploaded to sort of a dashboard situation, but it can save you money in the long term in terms of recording trends and predicting pest management. So sort of getting deep into the weeds here, we talked a lot about sticky cards, but I want to highlight that they are somewhat of a passive way of monitoring. And there's benefits to passive and active ways of monitoring. So passive means you sort of put something up and sort of walk away and forget about it for a bit and come back to it next week, or you're not doing much activity with it. So things like sticky cards are passive monitoring. So they are good because you're not spending a ton of time on them. Like I said, you're putting them up 1 day a week, going back 7 days later often and checking them. And they are good for insects that fly and disperse. So things like fungus gnats, shore flies, and changes in thrips pressure, but they're not going to catch things that don't fly or don't fly well. Like whitefly don't tend to get stuck on the sticky cards very much. Aphids, if you have aphids on your sticky cards, you have a way bigger aphid problem somewhere else in your greenhouse. So sometimes a better example is an indicator plant. So this is a plant that's very, very attractive to the pest compared to your crop plants. So an example is eggplant for whitefly or beans for spider mites. So we can often set these out in the crop and then you check that and that tells you, ooh, like the spider mites and whitefly have gotten here early. I probably need to look at the rest of this crop and treat. But if you don't see them, then you're probably good. I also count walking the crop as a passive way of monitoring. Yes, you are physically walking the crop, but you're sort of just scanning the crop for early indicators of damage that are showing on the top, right? So you might be looking for wilting or some aphid skins or a plant that just doesn't look right, but it doesn't really quantify damage and you're going to miss a lot of things that are happening underneath the leaves or in the roots. So another tip from someone in the field, Kelly Smith, she's the field service rep for BioBee Canada. Her tip is when scouting, doing that crop walking, is to remember to go to the windows and the walls. And that's because scouts get really busy sometimes, and sometimes they get focused on just the front of the rows or doing it quickly. But we often find pests explode near walls or areas of stress. So that could be where the boiler is and it's hotter, or maybe it's where your nutrient lines run or don't run to, and you have a place at the back of the greenhouse that's not getting enough fertilizer or not getting enough water. that can cause explosions because those plants are under a bit more stress. So her tip is to always check the rows along the back of the wall, since a lot of pests like to hide there. So getting into active ways of monitoring, this is actually picking up the plant. And I'll tell you what to look for in a minute, or how to actually scout these plants. We mentioned about plant taps. We also want to take plants out of the pots to look for things like root mealybugs or root aphids and any plant diseases if that plant is looking a little sickly. And we mentioned plant washings as well. So another tip from Sarah Stivey, the IPM manager for Global Horticultural. Her tip is to focus. I really feel this one when she says it's tempting to start multitask while scouting, entering data or like pulling weeds or checking watering or emails or things like that. But if you start multitasking while you're scouting, you're going to miss something. You need to be very focused on the plants and the insects. So the reason we want to do active monitoring is it's good for these smaller pests, things like thrips and spider mites, and pests that live under leaves or even on the stems. So this is a picture of mealybug. They like to be under the flower heads. So if you're walking through the crop, you may not even notice this until you pick it up and then realize, like, ooh, this stem is a little gross. And it also helps you determine what's on the crop versus just what's in the environment of the greenhouse. Sticky cards actually capture, dispersing thrips. So they may capture what's sort of like flying through your greenhouse area, but they're not necessarily capturing what's on the crop and the damage they might be causing. So when you do pick up a plant, you want to look at all areas of plant. So the new growth attracts different pests than old growth. So new growth, things like whitefly, aphids and thrips love new growth. Older growth, spider mites seem to be very attracted to that, or other aphid species. Foxglove aphid seems to like older growth versus green peach likes newer growth. The stems can attract a surprising variety of insects. Oleander aphid and chrysanthemum aphid both seem to really like stems. We talked about mealybugs. There's also scale insects. Then you also want to look at the surface of the pot for things like fungus gnats and shoreflies. If your fungus gnat levels are high, and you're just catching them on cards but aren't sure where they're coming from, you can usually see them running across the surface of a plant if it's been overwatered. You also want to look for things like fungi and algae growing on the surface of the pots. That can often be your fungus gnat problem and be evidence that you're overwatering, which will lead to both fungus gnat issues and potentially disease issues. And obviously, like I said, checking the roots if possible for things like root mealybug and disease. So I do just want to give you a quick comparison of why I like both using plant taps, which are active, and sticky cards, which are passive, because they kind of tell you different things. Like I said, the cards are useful because they're sort of like quick and dirty, and everyone has time for those. But sometimes they can lead to you missing things. So this is an actual scenario from an on-farm trial I did. So the scenario is you go into your greenhouse before and after treatments, and we're monitoring thrips levels with cards, which are in the green line, or plant taps, which are on the blue line. And we've already set our economic threshold, which is 5 thrips per plant or per card over a week. So you've gone in and you've looked at your cards that you've put up the past week. So that's where that data is coming from for the cards. And you also do a plant tap at the same time. So that's where the data is coming from for the blue line. So this is what your data looks like. So if we look at week 48 and the green line, which is cards, this card data actually tells you what happened between when you first put up the card a week ago and now. So this data is actually data from the past. It's not capturing what's on the plants now at all. So if we just looked at the card data based on this, we wouldn't have started spraying until week 49, and look at how much those thrips numbers increased. Instead, because we also tapped, we saw a peak happen at week 48, because this data is telling us what's happening in the present. When we're knocking thrips off the plants, that's what's actually happening now and now on the plants. So based on that, this was above threshold, we decided to spray. So you don't have to tap a huge number of plants. Just a couple in an area near a sticky card can give you a better picture than just the cards. You can also do things like look at the flowers if you're dealing with a pest that's really attracted to flowers. And it's just important to keep in mind that cards are especially slow to show decreases after treatment. So they can be okay to show increases. You're about a week behind, but Where I feel like growers really get into issues is after a treatment. So for example, our yellow circle here with spray 1, if you were to look at the card information, it looks like we treated and then all the thrips numbers went up. So a grower just looking at that data would conclude, oh, the spray didn't work or things got worse. And that might have led to a second spray right away when that was actually unnecessary. When we looked at the tapping data, we saw they were already below threshold after the first spray. So really optimal monitoring is a combination of active and passive monitoring, your two main tools being cards and plant inspections, and also plant taps. So I would recommend walking the crop weekly for signs of damage, counting your cards weekly, looking for population increases and hot spots. You can also just do presence absence sampling when you're picking up plants. So you're picking up a plant, looking at the meristems, looking at the old growth, looking at the stems. And then you just want to be like, are there whitefly here? Are there aphids here? Yes, no. You don't have to get into counting them. That's sort of too much work and doesn't give you the information you need. And then you can sort of just report, okay, of the 5% of plants I sampled, how many were infested? And if that sounds like a lot, looking at 5% of the plants, it's really not that much on a bench of 330 plants. That's only about 15 plants per bench. And if you're just picking it up and being like, does this have a pest? Yes, no, it really doesn't take that long. You might want to do some plant taps if something's looking weird, or if you want to know what thrips life stages you're looking at for, or potentially identification of pest. So we've got another pro tip from Charlotte Coates, who's the IPM lead from Royal Brinkman. So she notes that it's important to understand the pest life cycle and make note of which life stages you're seeing, and you can do this for your bios too. And that brings me into a case study where life stage turned out to be really, really important in monitoring that I'm going to go through. So again, this is from a working farm. They were growing garden mums inside in the greenhouse. And people always ask me for numbers, like, okay, if I'm looking at my sticky cards, like, what's the threshold? How many thrips is normal? And I can't give you a number. It's what's normal for your greenhouse, and then establishing that what's normal for you, and then looking for variation. So this grower knew that 20 thrips per card on average over his farm was normal for the summer in his chrysanthemum crop. This year, or the year we did the study in 2016, he noticed this huge spike in late June, up to 60 thrips per card per week. So he knew something was going on. He was doing a biocontrol program for thrips. It was mite-based, so these eat the larvae of thrips. But not only was he noticing this huge spike in thrips numbers, but also his garden mums were getting damaged. So he did a little bit of an investigation. He did a plant tap, and he realized that all the thrips on the plants were adults. So that means they're not reproducing in the crop, they're flying in from outside. And the unfortunate news for him here was that the mite-based program he was using doesn't work for adult thrips. Mites can't eat adults. So he had to pivot. So there's the adults. So he had to pivot his biocontrol program and use things like sticky tape to catch the adult thrips, and Aureus, which is a predatory bug that eats adult thrips as well as larvae. And then you can see his trap card numbers of thrips went down to well below threshold by the time the plants were ready for sale in August, and they were actually able to grow out of the damage. So because he caught this change in his farm early and was able to pivot his IPM strategies, that means he was able to sell everything. We're going to quickly go over scouting for diseases, because most of the stuff I've talked about so far is really focusing on plant stuff. And then we're going to go quickly into data recording and then finish up. So for plant diseases, you really want to look for things like leaf spots, yellowing leaves, wilting plants, stunted growth, and then follow up with taking these plants out of the pots to look at roots. So one thing I just have to say about any of the root diseases, things like rhizoctonia that can cause this like wilting and flooping of the plants and the rotting of the stems, is it's very rare to be able to actually look at a plant and be like, oh, that's rhizoctonia. Like in Kalanchoe, we can sort of tell that apart. Most of the time you can't really. So in terms of knowing what fungicide to follow up with, you often need lab DNA diagnostics to tell you what disease it is, or you have to go in with like a pretty broad spectrum chemical. So some foliar diseases you might want to look for are things like plant viruses, which cause things like leaf spots, especially these rings with lighter centers and darker edges. You can also see a different patchwork of colors. And often a lot of viruses will just cause plant stunting and yellowing as well. So that's something to realize that that may be a virus. And then another thing we see is a lot of crinkling of leaves or leaf malformation. And these products, and this slide came from Judy Colley from Plant Products, who's a pro at diseases in tropical plants. So the other thing you're going to want to look for is fungi. These can be similar to looking to viruses sometimes, but each fungi really has a different appearance in terms of the symptoms that shows up on plants. So you're going to want to get familiar with the diseases that can attack your crop specifically. They can also mimic bacterial issues, but often bacterial issues you can smell because they're actually rotting with bacteria. But like I said, it's just important to get to know the kinds of fungi that attack your crops. And then keep in mind that not all spots are diseases or viruses. Different environmental factors, like not enough light, too much watering, cold, can also cause spots and discoloration. And this won't spread, but it also might not be fixable depending on the stage of growth. So how do you know if it's an environmental issue or some sort of pest, whether it's a disease or an insect pest? We're going to have to do some detective work. So there's questions I usually ask my growers that you can ask yourself. So when you see a problem, ask if it's uniform or patchy. So this problem, especially if this cat got up and you noticed all these flattened plants, it's a very patchy problem. Baxter's causing a patchy problem. Here's another example. Are leaf spots, are they symmetrical or asymmetrical? So symmetrical things are often caused by nutritional issues. Asymmetrical is often from diseases. Here's another example of what was a nutrient deficiency. And so you can ask yourself questions like, is it happening in just one variety, several varieties, or is it happening in the whole crop? And is it spreading or staying stable? And then the last question you want to ask yourself is, does it appear in multiple crops or multiple cycles of that crop, or is it confined to a short crop or a short period or specific crop? So here's an example of Fusarium in poinsettia. They weren't having Fusarium issues on the rest of their farm, but every year in their poinsettia crop, they were losing 10 to 15% of their crop, poinsettia crop, and it ended up being due to Fusarium. So this was a disease issue because it was restricted to just a specific crop. So overall, these questions, I've sort of color-coded them. There's exceptions to all of these, but anything in green is more likely to be an abiotic or environmental factor, whereas anything in blue is more likely to be a pest, really probably a disease in a lot of these examples, but it could be a pest issue, like an insect issue as well. So, take a screenshot of these questions, ask yourself these when you run into an issue, and then work with your extension agent or your company rep to maybe help figure out what's causing the issue. And then in a lot of these cases with diseases, and this is also true for other things that are difficult to control but don't spread quickly, things like mealybug and scales, is I'm a big fan of roguing out plant material. I know growers don't love to throw things out, but often it's not worth treating. So if you find, a plant with mealybugs on it or a plant with virus starting on it, you want to throw out that plant and then all the plants immediately around it because they are probably already infested or infected. In terms of where to spend your time looking for diseases, the environment really matters. So the watering type, we're going to get a lot more leaf spots or things like powdery mildew when there's overhead watering. So you might want to watch these more, but keep in mind that ebb and flow benches or things on dripper lines can also spread root rots. And after you do this roguing out of potentially infested plants, you want to keep checking to make sure the problem isn't spreading, which can especially happen on flood benches. And maybe also do some preventative fungicides and most importantly, sanitize between crops because prevention is worth a pound of cure. And honestly, with diseases, it's very hard to cure most plant diseases. In most cases, you're just slowing down the spread to other plants. So catching it early in propagation or at receipt and maybe getting rid of it is probably going to save you more money in the end, especially in terms of shrink later if some of these diseases don't cause like big collapses until later on. Also, it's going to save you money because, like I said, you're just going to be playing catch up with fungicide rotations. So we're going to talk about record keeping quickly. It's all great for someone to do scouting and write it down on sheets, but the most important thing is for it not to stay on the page. You actually need to get it into some way to communicate that data effectively, usually Excel where you can graph it, or some sort of scouting software, or at least a report in an email that goes out to everyone. So you want to make sure your scouting sheets are prepared in a way where you can record both sticky card counts, but also your crop observations, and also have a place for notes and include an entry for whether a problem was solved or not from the previous week. So there are lots of pre-made sheets out there already. Again, extension from universities is a great place to look. So the University of Massachusetts has these great pages you can download of sticky card counts or crop walking. I've also made spreadsheets that you can print off for scouting sheets and then also enter the data into this. And this is on my blog, which I'll talk about at the end, which is on floriculture.com. And also to make your life incredibly easy, I've actually made where you enter this data of your observations, I've made it total up at the end of the spreadsheet and actually produce graphs of pest pressure for the different quarters of the year. So that I did this for our on-farm or our on-site research greenhouses at Vineland because they were having trouble keeping on top of things. So I will put these raw files under our how-to videos on the blog, which I'll link to this recording of this video. So one thing about data sheets that Cassie Russell, our nursery and landscape specialist, points out is that zeros are important. If you don't have a zero, it's hard to know whether you just didn't notice the problem or it wasn't there. So like a zero tells you I looked and it wasn't there. And then you have more confidence about your data later when a past problem does show up, you know that it wasn't there before, but it is there now. So communication. Okay, so as I mentioned, we don't want this information to stay on the page. We want to make sure it gets communicated to the right people. So it's often best to schedule a time to relay the information to the people in charge and the people taking action. And you also want to get the whole team involved. And I'm also going to point out that visuals are everything. I just think a graph is worth 1,000 words. This was an example from that research farm or research I was doing with a commercial grower where the scout was sort of verbally telling us stuff at the beginning of the year. And, after Christmas, we sort of can't remember what happened before Christmas. So she was saying stuff like, I don't know, the cards are, not that high, around 10, per card, but the taps are meh. And I think at the time we were all just like, sounds great. And then the numbers increased dramatically. So if we'd actually looked at the graph, we would have realized like, ooh, these numbers are pretty high to when we actually made the decision to spray before. So we would have sprayed a lot earlier had we seen a graph versus just her told us orally. Another hot tip from Paul Kelly is that he likes to provide all staff. So even, weekend staff or those doing the pinching or the watering, educational pest in pictures to hang in the greenhouse or lunchroom or hallways or even in the crop. Because really everyone that works for you, they're a set of eyes that can identify a pest problem for you. And again, it's about getting on top of it early. So here's an example of a greenhouse in their shipping bay, putting up pictures of different pests and the damage they cause so that everyone is aware of what they're looking for. And then you also want to do a post-mortem each year in terms of what went right, what went wrong, and what should we change. So here's an example from a grower who does spring bedding crops, who every year makes a list of his bad boy crops for Western flower thrips. He puts, what action he's planning on taking, and then he makes notes about whether that worked or not or what we're going to try next year. So overall, good scouting means that you're going to learn from prior years. You're going to develop standard operating procedures that work for your farm. You'll end up with cleaner plants, and you should be spending less money on shrink and pest management. And then lastly, I'm just going to end with shameless blog promotion. This is the On Floriculture blog. We put up timely information about both pest and production issues related to floriculture. We have some other IPM how-to videos that might be of interest. I have recorded webinars, and there's also our IPM 101 course that we recorded during the pandemic, which has everything you would ever want to know about greenhouse pests and how to identify them and how to use biocontrol agents. So if this is at all interesting to you, please enter your email address and subscribe. And we try not to harass you with too many posts at once.
That was fantastic, Sarah. So let's just open it up to the group. Anybody that wants to unmute right now, you can ask Sarah a question.
Yeah, I just opened the chat so I can read them back. So someone's asking, do you find the sticky cards interfere with biologicals? So that's a great question. I've actually done research on that. They don't so much. So people used to think, oh, we should use blue cards for Western flower thrips because they trap more Western flower thrips, but don't trap biologicals. They do trap less biologicals, but often blue are not as good for Western flower thrips. So we recommend people do use the yellow cards because it's easier to count them. You also are catching other pests like fungus gnats and whitefly that are only attracted to yellow. And the number of bios you're going to catch on your sticky cards is really nominal. It's maybe 5% losses or 10% losses at max with something like Aphidius colemanni, an aphid parasitoid. And that's a perfectly acceptable loss in terms of what we just do in general in our greenhouses with biologicals when we're applying soft chemicals. Those have up to 25% mortality on our bios. So to me, I think the trade-off is well worth it. You might lose some, but the monitoring is better with sticky cards, especially yellow ones.
So I actually have a question. The slides where you were talking about the indicator plants, just I don't know what it is with me, but I just fear that you're inviting whitefly or whatever into your growing environment with that. What's the best practices around how long the indicator plants should stay in, and that fear that I have?
That's a absolutely valid fear. Some of the best practices around those are the ones we like are the ones you can grow from seed very quickly. So you should be producing them in your own greenhouse from seed and then putting them out yourself. Because if you do get them in from another farm, they could bring in pest problems with you. I agree. Most of these, are pretty easy to grow. And then you have to know the life cycle of the pest that you're aiming for. So for example, eggplant with whitefly. I do this a lot with growers. The whitefly life cycle is pretty slow. It's over 21 days from egg to adult. So as soon as you see whitefly on there, you've got about 3 weeks before you would have to bag that up and throw it out. And then you want to replace it with another eggplant. So if it's thrips though, say you're using marigolds or verbena or something that's really attractive to thrips, their life cycle is shorter, around 14 days. So the second you see thrips on that, those have to be bagged up and replaced within 14 days. So you just want to make sure they don't turn into a breeding plant. The idea is for them to be sort of like a trap plant, and a trap plant always has to be thrown out before a full life cycle of the pest.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you can always email me if you have a question at sarah.jandricic@ontario.ca. My information's all up on the blog as well. So you can find me through there as well.
Okay, cool. Well, I have one more question that
Sure.
that hopefully will be of interest to the participants. And it's more about when the plants leave the growing fields in our operations and get transferred over to the retail space. Typically with annuals and even small potted tropicals and stuff, is there a ideal length of time before that product is really aged and it should be off the floor, besides how they look?
I think when it relates to pests, not so much, as long as they're being well cared for, and that you're not starting to notice pest problems like fungus gnats. So I feel like it all comes down to watering. Often what I hear from my commercial producers that sell to retail centers and often end up getting credits back is because the plants haven't been well taken care of. The watering isn't great. So remember that any kind of stress, environmental, watering not the right light, is going to make that plant more susceptible to pests and diseases. So yeah, I don't think it's a time frame. It's going to vary by plant, but just making sure that your retail center is very well cared for.
Yeah. And then I guess the other thing with the retail centers is many of them, especially through early May, just the temperature changes between the growing environment and where we're trying to
Mhm.
sell them is often 10 or 15 degrees. So that's a shock for many plants too.
Yep. Someone in the chat has mentioned that Brian Krug has a video on dichotomous cues for nutritional deficiencies. I think that's great. I'm going to be looking that up. I think also, yeah, being able to tell your nutritional deficiencies apart from your diseases is really educational. Someone else is asking, we've been hesitant to use Aureus, which is a predatory bug. Do they consume many beneficial bios too? They are theoretically a generalist in that they will eat a lot of squishy bugs, but they do prefer the squishy bugs and things that don't run very fast. So they like whitefly, they like aphid, they like thrips. Um, they're not going to be eating any of your parasitoids, even other big bugs. It's just like too much of a challenge for them. And inherently, most predators are lazy, so they're going to stick with the squishy things. So we often use in the production part of greenhouses like a whole community of biocontrol agents, and they all work well together.
Wonderful. Well, Sarah, let's just wrap it up by saying thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm really excited that it is going to be recorded and available to everybody. And then also a shout out to all of your experts that provided you with tips. They were great. I love the zero entry tip. That's so important. So thank you.
Yeah, have a great day, everyone.
Thanks all.